Well, on behalf of my co-authors, we're very grateful for the opportunity to present this story here today. Most times we talk about lake trout at the lake committee meetings in the Great Lakes, and so we are very appreciative to be able to speak here today. My talk will follow this general flow. We're going to talk a little bit about first the historic population, then talk about the rehabilitation efforts that have gone on to date, followed by a little bit of the status of the stocks, and then some of the impediments that have been identified towards restoration for lake trout in Lake Erie. So for those of you who don't know where Lake Erie is, we are at the bottom of the Great Lakes. Some people who are awfully negative refer to Lake Erie and Lake Ontario as the settling basin for the upper lakes. But yet they are very distinct, and they actually have a high diversity of fish species. I hope by the end of this talk I can convince you that studying and pursuing restoration in Lake Erie is a noble effort. First of all, I think it tells us a lot about the ability of the species, because we are in the southernmost distribution of their range, as well as the role that they play in the Lake Erie ecosystem. So Lake Erie, just a little bit general information, shallowest but the most productive of the Great Lakes, has a long history of ecological issues, and yes, the fires on the Cuyahoga River have officially been put out. And they support large recreational and commercial fisheries throughout the lake, so highly exploited throughout the range. Today I'll talk about areas such as the Western Basin, which is shallow, eutrophic, and isothermal, generally does not stratify at all. The Central Basin, which will exhibit some weak stratification, considered to be mesotrophic, and then seasonally anoxic. So during the summer, for a couple months, there may be anoxia that sets up in large dead zones below the hypolymnion, which is generally only a meter or two from the bottom, so not your typical stratification. And then the Eastern Basin, which is very deep, considered to be meso or oligotrophic, and has adequate oxygen for salmonids and Charr species. Some of you may have seen this picture before. Lake Erie was one of the highest producers of commercial fishing back in the 1800s and early 1900s. Here's a catch of Corrigonids, or Corrigonians. Anyway, Lake Herring, as I like to refer to them, or Cisco, and Lake Whitefish dominated these catches. After these species were collapsed, which is interesting, is that they started going after the less desirable species, which were perkids, which is hard for me to imagine today, especially when they're getting about $18 to $20 a pound for perkids. But anyway, a little brief history. Today, the population supports large walleye and yellow perch fisheries throughout the lake, as well as supporting large commercial and recreational fisheries. Fairly unique situation that's set up here. So, diving into the historic population. What's kind of interesting is that the lake trout actually supplied a major component of the fish community prior to European colonization. Lake trout were very abundant from what I can ascertain, and in fact, they were very common, generally not something you would associate with Lake Erie. They actually, it seems as if they actually collapsed the population, or at least overexploited it, before they even started keeping records. So there's really not great records on the harvest of lake trout, but it seems like the damage had been done before they even started keeping official records. And during the late 1800s, there were some years where over 100,000 pounds of lake trout were harvested. There are accounts of very large fish. In America we refer to the feet and pounds, which is always what I'm used to. So 4.5 feet or 75 pounds. There are actually records of fish coming out of the eastern basin of Lake Erie. So in the eastern basin, as it was in the past, it still is today, lake trout are most numerous in this end of the lake. But what I find very interesting and intriguing is that there were historical and contemporary reports of lake trout in the western basin, specifically around the Detroit River and around the islands area. Even today, commercial trap net fishermen will catch lake trout in their trap nets around the islands in the western basin. Now, they're considered to be scarce, but yet they still do exist there. And they're really not that common in the central basin. It seems it's more of a transition zone for these fish. There were noticeable population declines at the end of the 1800s and early 1900s. You had an expanding and poorly regulated, emphasis on poorly regulated commercial fishery in Lake Erie. And when they noticed this decline, they actually started stocking lake trout. And I find this very interesting. Almost 500,000 yearlings were stocked in the western end of Lake Erie during this time frame. So there's one of two hypotheses. Either A, they just started stocking them there because that's where the hatchery was, and they just wanted to prove, hey, we can do it, which is not out of the realm of possibility, and they were introducing them in the Western Basin. Or lake trout were actually important to some fisheries, and they found a need to release them. Anyway, 750,000 fish annually for a long period of time, pretty impressive, in my opinion. But by the 1950s, the majority of the population had disappeared. Overexploitation, habitat loss, and exotic species, namely sea lamprey, were kind of the causes indicated there. And there was a complete loss of native stocks thought to occur by 1965. So any of the remnant stocks that existed were gone by about 1965. Moving a little bit into rehabilitation efforts, and this is what we kind of refer to as the modern rehabilitation era, kind of beginning somewhere around 1969, where 17,000 surplus yearlings were stocked in the Pennsylvania waters of Lake Erie, again on the edge of the eastern basin. Since that time, since 1982, the population had been increasing, and then the annual stockings were up. Approximately 160,000 yearlings were stocked on a regular basis. Survival to maturity was low until sea lamprey control was initiated in 1986. And of course, this is operated under the auspice of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, the Sea Lamprey Control Program. So, combination of stocking and sea lamprey control resulted in an expanding population during the 1990s. Fairly popular sport fisheries in Pennsylvania and New York popped up with no commercial fishing. What's interesting is if you talk to the people who target lake trout on Lake Erie, 30 and 40 fish days are not uncommon for the people who know what they're doing. Nearshore spawning activity was evident, but no natural recruitment has been detected. So during the fall, you will see fish in the nearshore areas spawning, but yet there have been no natural recruitment has been detected. Fitzsimons and Williston actually did collect viable fertilized eggs off of several locations in the eastern basin. However, no natural recruitment has been observed in the surveys. So the goal of the rehabilitation efforts is to develop and maintain a lake trout population which produces measurable levels of natural recruitment. Lake trout are considered to be the apex predator by the fish community goals and objectives in Lake Erie. So establishing this population, this species, is important for the long-term sustainability of the ecosystem in the lake. And so a few things were identified, objectives were identified. They wanted to increase lake trout abundance, maintain some type of minimum spawning stock biomass, suppress sea lamprey control, which would ultimately increase lake trout survival, and then identify and evaluate existing spawning habitat. So there's one of my co-authors, and I was like, man, you got to be careful about the pictures you send me for presentations, because I will use them. If we take a look here of the status of, or the number of lake trout yearlings that are stocked on an annual basis, you see a few patterns. And the first pattern you see is majority of the fish, at least in terms of frequency, are the fish that originate from Lake Superior. These are from, I'm sorry, I get ahead of myself again. Multiple strains and morphotypes have been stocked throughout the history. So you have fish from the Finger Lakes region and Lake Superior being the most frequent and most numerous. So leans are the most common morph, and these originate from the Finger Lakes and the Superior strains, and these are, I think, the Slate Island and Apostle Island strains. And then you have the humpers, a morph that was introduced for a few years, the Klondikes. All fish are coded, wire tagged, and on an annual basis for age and stock contribution. On an annual basis, the LEC agencies, Lake Erie Committee agencies, conduct a cold water assessment, gillnet sites around the eastern basin, generally starting about 90 feet of water, and it targets them when the lake is stratified. And you can see here where all those gillnet sites are in the figure. If you take a look at the condition of these fish, generally these fish have very high condition factors. I think one of our co-authors referred to them as plumpers. They're all generally pretty fat and pretty happy. And the trends kind of are consistent over the last 20 years or so. with high K values. Take a look at the catch rates. The Lake Erie Committee established a targeted catch rate of 8 fish per gill net lift. You can see that either A, they were overly optimistic, or we haven't been able to achieve that goal of 8 fish per net since that was established in 2008. I find this graph kind of interesting. If you recall, the Lake Superior strain have been stocked on an annual basis, and they're generally about 40% of the total number of fish stocked. But what you see is that these Lake Superior fish do not show up in the strain contribution. So very low or poor survival for this strain in Lake Erie. Now, the caveat to this is it's only stocked up in Ontario waters, so there may be something with habitat. Anyway, find that very interesting. If we take a look at the annual survival rates, the Finger Lakes and Lake Champlain strains have an annual survival rate over what the target level of 0.6 had been set, and then those Superior and Klondike strains had a lower survival rate. The Healy paper was mentioned earlier, where they're looking at you don't want annual mortality to be any higher than 0.5, with natural mortality rates between 0.2 and 0.3. But if you take a look at our mortality rates for some of these stocks, and there's really essentially very little fishing mortality, because so few are caught, it's really all natural mortality. So natural mortality appears to be fairly high in Lake Erie. The group also identified some impediments to restoration in the rehabilitation plans released in '83 and 2008. They identified stocking limitations in terms of the spatial coverage. Historically, they were stocking in very limited places, and now they've expanded where they've been stocking fish around the lake, as well as different strains. Of course, invasive species are an impediment, potentially insufficient spawner biomass, and then habitat limitations. If we take a look here, we take a look at the A1 and A3 wounding rates. So prior to sea lamprey control, you can see that the wounding rates were very high. After sea lamprey control, they decreased, but they're still above the long-term, they're still above the rates that have been established. Interestingly, they've only achieved wounding rates below the target for about 20% of the time. And that's likely because sea lamprey abundance has remained, relatively high in Lake Erie. The tributaries are annually treated, but there seems to be some other sources that we're not necessarily keying in on and treating at the appropriate levels at this point. The Fish Commission is working very hard and has provided the sea lamprey control with a lot of sleepless nights, I assume, on how to get this back into control. So if we take a look at lake trout abundance in the pre versus post lamprey control era, what you see is you had a high abundance of total lake trout, then it declined during the late 90s, and then slowly has been on the upswing. But I think this really tells the story, and these are the trends in adults through time, is that the number of adults that are in Lake Erie are well below, or generally below, the target of 75,000 fish. Annual survival rates, if we take a look at annual survival rates, again, about 50% of the time our annual survival rate's higher than what the target has been established. Taking a little bit a look at spawning habitat here. Here we have pictures from Brockton Shoal in New York. The upper panel picture is a picture taken in 1988 by Edsel, nice clean substrate. Then in 2009, zebra mussels kind of proliferated and covered the substrate. I don't know that these are necessarily bad. I'm not really keen to spawning substrate. Other species in Lake Erie seem to do all right spawning on zebra mussel covered substrates, but we are looking at the substrates. And then here we take a look at somewhere in Presque Isle, where these pictures were taken basically in the same week, and the quality varies quite a bit from location to location. And lastly, I'll finish up talking a little bit about some of the telemetry work we've been doing, trying to identify spawning habitat in Lake Erie. So basically this consisted of going out in the spring, tagging a bunch of fish throughout the eastern basin, and then putting out a bunch of these acoustic receivers around the perimeter and taking a look about where fish go when spawning season comes around. This is all done through the Great Lakes Acoustic Telemetry Observation System that some of you heard about already today. And basically what we're looking at is individual detection history, looking at detection histories of individual fish. And so what we do is we take a look at, okay, hopefully I can, okay. We look at where these fish go during the spawning period. We kind of blocked off November to December as the spawning period for Lake Trout and Lake Erie. And what we're able to do is follow where these fish end up during that period. And so here you see this individual kind of milling around and then all of a sudden keying in on this area, which is between New York and Pennsylvania. So we're going to use the telemetry data hopefully to tell us where these fish are indeed spawning. Also look at the kind of habitat they're trying to look at, as well as other study objectives include describing the interlake movements. We're watching fish go across Lake Erie, which I don't think anybody kind of thought would happen. And then we're also going to be determining thermal habitats used by lake trout because these fish have thermal loggers on them. So to kind of wrap this up, historically, Lake Erie supported self-sustaining populations. Important to this, the stability of the ecosystem in the eastern basin predominantly. Then we observed large-scale population declines due to overharvest, sea lamprey, and then changes in the habitat. Recruitment failure is evident, and then stocking currently supports the population. There's been a large effort directed towards controlling sea lamprey in Lake Erie, as in the other lakes, and we're currently in the process of trying to identify bottlenecks to natural recruitment. I thank you for your time. We owe a special word of thanks to the Great Lakes Fish Commission for the work that they do controlling sea lamprey in Lake Erie, as well as the Fish and Wildlife Service for the lake trout they produce on a regular basis to sustain the population. With that, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Yes, Mike.
Chris, it's hard to reconcile the mortality rates you're observing with the fact that you said there's very little fishing mortality. So I'm curious, how do you estimate mortality? Is that an explanation for why it seems so extraordinarily high? You know, if you did it by catch curve and recruitment's going up, it'll give you a false impression of the mortality rate. I'm just trying to figure out why it's so high for your fish.
So the survival rates that I showed you here were based on the gillnet catches, and so there could be some issues with vulnerability to the gear and so on and so forth. So some of those mortality rates may be, or biases may be tied up in that. You're absolutely right. That's where we're also hoping to use the telemetry for, is because these are, what I didn't show you is we have a few receivers in Lake Erie, and so what we're really hoping to do is use the telemetry to narrow down when these things are dying through, I like to call direct observation, although it's not direct observation. But so I suspect we'll be refining some of those mortality survival estimates using the telemetry data.
I'm just wondering, any ideas why the fingerlings from Lake Erie are so much poorer at survival than the fingerling lakes? Is because the environmental factors they go are so different?
That's a good question. The question was why the superior fish tend to not be doing so well. They are, again, stocked on the North Shore by Ontario, so there could be some poorer habitat up there or higher predation, or it could be a strain effect. We're not exactly sure. It's kind of like we're getting hands on fish, putting them in the lake, and kind of seeing what takes. And so I think in the future there will be maybe some more directed attempts for evaluating that.
Chris, are you doing telemetry tagging on Klondikes? Or can you tell, actually?
So the question is, are we, you can hear it. So we're taking a genetic sample, and they tell us that they can identify which strain the fish is based on a genetic sample. At the time, we were just trying to get transmitters and fish. So I doubt it's going to work out that we can, take a look at that, the different strains and the different morphotypes. I think that lends itself to a great experimental project in the future where we would get known morphotypes, put transmitters in them, and look at their differential survivals through time in a system like Lake Erie.
I have a question, Chris. During the spawning time, does that western basin have waters that are cool enough to actually support lake trout? lakes are during spawning?
Yeah, so once the lake turns over, I mean, whitefish pull off recruitment in the Western Basin. So yeah, once it destratifies, it cools off fairly rapidly. You also have the Detroit River, which is generally very cold. We're in the process of actually looking at that and modeling that the thermal patterns on a seasonal basis to kind of look at that. I mean, a lot of people just kind of laughed and scoffed when I presented that idea, but I don't know. They're traveling up there for a reason, and historically they were found in the Detroit River. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.